limiting compression, just stacking compressors, stuff like that. Anything to kind of just make the low end sit and not move around a great deal. And then on the the mid and high tracks, I'm obviously filtering out the low end, and that is where I perhaps might have reamped something through an amp to just get the kind of aggressive, distorted character out of it. I can let that stuff move around a little bit more than the low end. It's okay if it kind of dynamically has a little bit more range. And I'm kind of looking for that clang and that twang and that spank around the probably 1.5 to 3.5 area. That's kind of become a lot more popular in metal now, like to have the bass have a bit of snarl and aggression up there and kind of sound
Snap.
more exactly sound more like a guitar.
I think of like 1.3 like to 2, like where you want that like the slap bass area, you know.
Yeah,
that's where
exactly
the way I play bass is I'm more of like that old school Jamerson McCartney thing. So I'm kind of trying to hone in on like the 600 to 800 area where you get more of that mid-range poke, which is what's great about P basses. I love like that P bass has that 6 to 800 poke, and like I don't like jazz basses because they have like a 2K poke, and for me it sounds wrong.
Right, yeah.
But it's whatever, teach their own, you know. Like obviously legit, whichever works. It's just taste, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you find depending on the tuning, that 2 to 3K poke is pretty popular in metal. So I don't mind a jazz bass. I'm always happy to see a jazz bass come through the studio, but
makes sense.
You find that like people are really going for that dark glass, aggressive 2 to 3K poke with the top end of the bass. So I'll have a mid band kind of exaggerating that, and I might have something like a dark glass pedal reamped on it, or a guitar amp, or the dark glass plug-in or something like that, just to kind of get the distortion and the that band exaggerated, and then from there they'll go off to their own bus, and I find that's probably where I can get a little bit more of the glue that I was lacking when I first started splitting bands, or I can do a little bit of extra compression and extra glue and extra EQ, just to kind of control the signal as a whole. And then from there, if I want to get clever, I can kind of automate the different bands up and down individually depending on the part of the song or part of the riff or something like that. So yeah.
That's clever. Yeah, it's so crazy how detailed you can get, and like sometimes you need it and sometimes you don't. And I guess it's all about choosing how detailed you need to get on this particular kind of thing.
But it has to be played right though. Like that's first and foremost. If for the more aggressive styles of things, like it has to be the place you pick the bass. Like I put a lot of emphasis on where the bass is picked in relation to the bridge. You know, we'll find that sweet spot that's got the perfect balance of like low fundamental to overtone, and I'll put a piece of tape on the bass just so we, you know, keep your finger and your pick over that spot, and dynamically I want the bass to be going in as evenly as possible. I mean, when the bass is all over the shop dynamically and it's played less than ideally, I find that splitting bands up or compression or any of those things is just a bit of a futile attempt to make something not so good or musical sound otherwise. And but playing it in is the most important part, getting it right.
Yeah, it's so true. It's funny how like with bass, it matters more than on guitar, like how you play it. What kind of strings you're using, which pickup you're using, and where is the pickup? Like for bass, that's, I mean, I guess that matters also on guitar, but like which pickup, right? Like the P bass pickup sounds completely different than the jazz pickup, and that sounds completely different than like a humbucker pickup, and like makes all the difference. And have you seen there was this video on YouTube that I saw recently with this guy, I think Jim Lill maybe, and he was like, "Where does tone come from?" And he basically built a guitar on a table with zero guitar. It was just like over nothing. And he compared it to his Telecaster with the exact same pickup in the exact same position, same strings, same level of height of pickup to the strings. and like there was no body, there was no neck, there was none of like the wood, any of that stuff, and it sounded exactly the same. And like the point of that experiment was like with guitar tone, it's like, I mean, obviously what kind of pick he used would have mattered, or if he did it with a finger instead. But like in terms of all the other things being equal, like it's just electronics. It's just like
exactly.
the guitar metallic string on the pickup making that tone, and that was like literally the entire thing. And so it's like for bass, where you're not getting all those kinds of extra distortions from the amp and the pedals, and there's less of that kind of craziness going on. What bass you use, what the strings are like, and how you pluck it and where you pluck it is the whole. That's the whole thing, and that's why, like, I guess bass players are so nerdy about these. There's a reason why I'm using a P bass and not a jazz bass. You know what I mean? Like
100%,
because it's such that's the whole thing, almost in a sense.
Yeah, it's so right. Yeah, there's less places to hide on the bass, and it just has to be right at the source. It really does.
Yeah, I guess you could like compress the snot out of the bass and then bounce it in place and then kind of split the bands. That might help. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I actually do more and more of that these days, particularly with things that are performed less than ideal. I'll bounce them in place, and I guess then that frees me up to process more heavily, and it's committing to something and having less plugins working in real time with a less than ideal performance is pretty important for sure.
So, but before we continue on in your process of like, I guess down the chain, like I want to hear also about vocals and stuff. But I noticed in particular your drums sounded amazing. Tell me a little bit about your process in terms of like getting the right drum tones, and maybe in terms of like how you mix drums in your records.
I think we spoke briefly about drums before we went to air, just about like, I'm a guitarist, but I love drums. Yeah, I think I love drum tones and chasing drum tones more than I enjoy guitar tones at this point, because it's something that's eluded me for quite a while, and I feel like in the past 2 or 3 years, my drum tones have only started to really come together. Like most things, you've just got to get it right at the source. Tuning was a really big thing for me to get my head around, and it was a bit of a dark art being a guitarist, learning to tune a drum kit well. So for me, it all starts with the drum and the head selection and the tuning, the very fundamental things. I mean, that's assuming that the player has got their stuff together. I mean, much like bass, a drummer that can finesse the drum and play dynamically where needed and get the most out of the tone without choking the drum is the most important thing. From there, just kind of deciding on depth and sizes of drums, what type of drum, whether you're going to go for a brass or a wood or a steel or something like that is pretty important. I mean, these days I've acquired a collection of pretty nice drums and snares that I just kind of bust out when I need a tone pretty quickly. And I mean, 9 times out of 10, when a drummer comes in, I encourage them to just use my gear, because the learning curve of a new drum kit can waste quite a bit of time in the setup process. So I've got things that I know work and can work for a variety of different scenarios. So, and I usually have my drums with fresh heads and tuned up, ready to go. And so that saves a lot of time, and I know how to work with those tones, and I know how to get the most out of them. I've got a selection of mics that I've narrowed down over the years that I know will work for certain applications. And I mean, in fact, I did a drum session about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the console was kind of acting up in the studio, and half of the returns weren't playing back. Mm-hmm. So I kind of found myself pulling a drum tone blind and deaf, so to speak. Half of the drum room mics and stuff like that, I wasn't getting a return on, but they were hitting the converters. I wasn't getting playback on them. So I kind of just fell back on experience, and it's like, well, I use this mic every time. I know I want it to sit this far away from the drum and point at this. And I kind of set everything up, and we hit record and did a couple of songs, and then I took the files over to my laptop and had a listen. And like, much to my surprise, I was like, cool, everything's sweet, you know, like as long as everything was gain staged well into Pro Tools, then I know how things are going to sound and how they're going to be treated in the mix. So I didn't really need the return on them.
Right.
So I kind of, you know, that's my process is selecting the drums, tuning them up to a miking, to a tuning scheme that I think is appropriate. You know, if the drummer is a bit of a softer hitter, I might go for a bit of a lower tuning scheme on the snare. If there's pretty busy stuff like blast beats and any of that crazy kind of silly stuff, I might go for a bit of a higher tuning scheme just to kind of find a happy medium between where the drummer feels the best and gets the best response and bounce, and where they're going to kind of sit above everything else in the mix sonically.
Yeah, I feel like the transients and like the tone of a snare drum matters so much when you're doing some of these like records that have like just like 64th notes and crazy shit. Like,
yeah.
You need it. You need, like, otherwise it's just gonna get all smeared, right? You really need to get that stuff dialed in.
You do, yeah, exactly. So it's very like just kind of determining, you know, which method you're going to use depending on the ability of the player and the desired results. And for me, it's again just performance, just getting the performance absolutely right. If we're working on one of those records that have the crazy 64th note double kicks and stuff, I think 8 times out of 10, I'm probably going to eliminate the kick drum from the equation, and that might look like using a mesh head or a kick pad or or just not playing kicks at all during certain parts, and either clicking them in later with MIDI or overdubbing them with a real kick drum, and getting the performance absolutely perfect and as close to good as we can is the most important part. And for me lately, taking really detailed and in-depth sample shots at the end of the session is a huge part of my workflow.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. That's cool. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, generally, back in the day when I was first starting to record drum kits, I would maybe just take a couple of hits and use a one shot. And I found that like that can work in scenarios where the drums are played and recorded really well. But it doesn't always get you out of trouble if the performance is overly dynamic or if the music is particularly fast. So much to the annoyance of the drummers I work with, after a 3 or 4 day long tracking session, the hardest part is when we're about to tear down the kit and we take samples, and it can be kind of torturous because I like to get very in depth. I like to take, you know, maybe 20 to 30 hits or more of each drum at maybe 3 or 4 velocities. So it can, as you can imagine, it can take up to 2 or 3 hours. And then from there, after I've edited the drums, I'll carve a little time out to cut all of those samples up and arrange them by mic and velocity. And then I'll make either a slate or a contact instrument with it. So in essence, I'm kind of making a very
sample packs.
Yeah.
very detailed sample packs.
Exactly. And I mean, over the years,
you have a product you can sell.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, over the years, it's kind of like it's amounted to hard drives full of essentially sample packs. And
man, you are pushing the limits there. I mean, I thought I was clever getting like a bunch of like crashes from like a drum session and like, you know, sprinkling them in my productions, but that's like next level, you know?
I mean, one could argue that it's probably unnecessary, you know, but as far as my workflow goes, I mean, it's been pretty necessary because if I want to get rid of the close mics, you know, say the drummer was overly dynamic and I want to get rid of their close mics, I'd rather have a very dynamically correct sample of the actual kit to replace it with, as opposed to, you know, a Slate or Superior.